Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Miss Marple and the Widow's Winter Confession, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Miss Marplet. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts. Let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed. Your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Widow's Unexpected Visitor. The rain had not ceased since afternoon. A relentless drizzle that turned the narrow lanes of St. Mary Mead into ribbons of glistening black and made the hedgerows bow beneath the weight of water. At the edge of the village, where the cottages gave way to fields and the fields to a lonely stretch of woodland, the old Partridge house stood, its stone walls dripping, its windows reflecting the occasional flicker of a carriage lamp passing down the lane. Inside, Mrs. Helena Partridge, widow of the late Colonel Partridge, drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she listened to the uncanny stillness that sometimes accompanies rain when the wind dies. She had banked the fire and told herself she would retire early, yet something in her manner betrayed restlessness. An unfinished letter sat on the escritoire, her pen abandoned mid-sentence, and her eyes kept straying to the grandfather clock in the hall. When the knock came, it was sharp and insistent, a staccato that startled her enough to make her spill the tea she had just poured. Visitors at so late an hour were uncommon in the village, and rarer still for a widow who kept much to herself. She hesitated at the door, her hand trembling against the brass handle, before she drew it open. A man stood there, tall, wrapped in a dark coat that glistened with rain, a trilby pulled low to conceal much of his face. His voice, when it came, was polite yet firm. "Good evening, madam. Forgive the intrusion. Might I come in?" The words were ordinary, yet something about the tone made Helena step back, almost against her will. He crossed the threshold without waiting for her consent and removed his hat, revealing features both striking and unsettlingly familiar. She felt certain she had seen him before, though she could not place where or when. His eyes, grey and piercing, rested on her with unnerving steadiness. "I trust you are Mrs. Partridge, widow of Colonel Arthur Partridge?" he asked. Her lips parted, uncertain whether to affirm or to demand an explanation. "I am," she said finally, her voice tight. "Then," he replied, setting his hat on the side table as if he owned the place, "we must speak of your husband's affairs, matters which, I assure you, are far from concluded." What followed was a conversation of such curious vagueness and sudden intensity that Helena later struggled to recall every word. He spoke of debts owed, of promises made in Cairo during the war years, of letters that had passed hands and had never reached their intended recipient. At one point he leaned forward, lowering his voice, and uttered the phrase, "The vase holds more than flowers, madam." It made little sense to her, yet he watched her closely, as though expecting recognition or fear. The exchange ended as abruptly as it began. He rose, donned his hat, and with a parting remark, "Best not to breathe a word of this to anyone, for your own sake," he vanished into the rainy night. She closed the door and leaned against it, her heart hammering, the chill of dread creeping along her spine. By morning the village was alive with gossip. For though Helena said nothing, her maid Clara had glimpsed the visitor from the upstairs landing and wasted no time in recounting it at the grocer's. Who was the stranger? Why had he come? St. Mary Mead thrived on such questions, and they made their way, inevitably, to the drawing-room of Miss Jane Marple, who sat by her lace-curtained window with her knitting, and listened with keen attention. An unexpected caller at that hour, and to Mrs. Partridge of all people. Miss Marple mused softly, eyes narrowing behind her spectacles. One wonders if he knew precisely how much to frighten her without saying a single actionable thing. Very curious. It was not long before Miss Marple, under the guise of paying a friendly call on the lonely widow, found herself ushered into the sombre drawing-room of Partridge House. Helena looked pale, almost wan, her hands fidgeting with her handkerchief as though she wished both to confide and conceal. Miss Marple, with her gentle questions that always seemed no more than kindly chatter, soon noticed two things of significance. First, the unfinished letter still lay on the escritoire, its ink smudged by what might have been a hurried blot. Yet Helena hastily moved to fold it away when Miss Marple's eyes alighted on it. Second, on the mantel stood a porcelain vase, delicate and oddly foreign in design, which seemed incongruous amidst the otherwise English furnishings. Miss Marple, with her remarkable eye for trifles, observed a fine hairline crack near its base, faint but noticeable. "You must have been alarmed, my dear," Miss Marple remarked, her needles clicking gently. "A strange gentleman at such an hour. Why, in a village like ours, it is almost unheard of." Helena forced a smile. Yes, indeed. It was nothing truly. A traveller who had mistaken the house, I dare say. "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, "but travellers seldom speak of Cairo, or of vases that hold more than flowers." The widow stiffened, her teacup rattling slightly in its saucer. Her lips parted, but no denial came. Only silence, followed by a hurried change of subject. Yet that flicker of fear did not escape Miss Marple's notice. As the old lady walked home through the damp lanes, her mind pieced together scraps of village knowledge, the colonel's service abroad, whispers of questionable dealings, Helena's sudden seclusion since his death, and now this mysterious visitor. It struck her that the phrase, "the vase holds more than flowers," was unlikely to be poetic fancy. A secret hidden in plain sight, perhaps. Miss Marple had seen many a case in which the most decorative of objects bore the heaviest of burdens. That evening she mentioned the matter casually to her nephew Raymond, who had motored down from London for a weekend. "People seldom speak in riddles without cause," she told him. "If one were to hide a document, or a key, or even something more damning, a hollow vase would be a most ingenious choice. Of course, it is only a surmise, but I fancy the late colonel may not have been quite the pillar of probity some thought him." Raymond laughed, accustomed to his aunt's sharp conjectures. Yet even he noticed her fingers falter briefly in their knitting when she recalled the widow's expression of dread. The days that followed did little to ease the village's unease. Helena Partridge withdrew further, refusing visitors, while her maid Clara, resentful at being silenced, hinted at overheard phrases and letters burned in the hearth. One evening, Clara appeared in Miss Marple's garden with a curious scrap she claimed to have found among the ashes, a torn corner of stationery bearing the embossed crest of a Cairo hotel, and scrawled in a hurried hand the words, "Deliver before it is too." Late Miss Marple examined it carefully, her brow furrowed. "Burned letters, secretive visitors, and a widow in fear," she murmured. "It has the makings of something quite serious, my dear." She tucked the fragment away, knowing such trifles often proved the hinge upon which greater matters turned. The chapter reached its climax on a storm-lashed night 1 week later. Helena Partridge was again alone in her house when a second knock came at the door. Clara, pale with fear, swore she heard voices in urgent tones, followed by the sound of something heavy striking the floor. By the time she summoned courage to descend, the hall was empty, save for the overturned vase upon the rug, its porcelain shattered, and amidst the shards a folded sheet of yellowing paper, half concealed. The widow herself was nowhere to be found. Word of the discovery spread swiftly, and Miss Marple was among the first to arrive. She bent with surprising agility to pick up the fragment, her keen eyes taking in the faded ink and unfamiliar hand. What she read there made her lips tighten, and her knitting bag fall to the floor unheeded. "It appears," she said quietly, almost to herself, "that our visitor was no chance traveler after all. And if this letter is genuine, then we are faced with a matter of murder yet to be uncovered." The storm raged outside. The broken vase lay scattered like bones, and the widow's absence was felt like a hollow in the house. Whatever lay written on that paper would change the course of St. Mary Mead's quiet days, and Miss Marple, calm yet grim, knew that this was only the beginning. Chapter 2. A locked room, no key. The storm had not yet abated when the village awoke to whispers of Mrs. Partridge's disappearance. The broken vase and the half-burned letter had set tongues wagging. But it was Clara, pale as linen, who carried the tale from kitchen to kitchen that the widow had been spirited away in the night. Miss Marple, who seldom missed a chance to listen to such gossip, sat very still as she heard Clara speak, her needles motionless in her lap. The detail that troubled her most was not the vanished mistress, nor even the foreign letter, but the curious state of the room in which she had last been seen. Clara swore she had gone to her bed with a candle after finding the vase shattered and the letter exposed. When morning came, the widow's bedroom door was locked from within. No answer came to Clara's frantic knocking, and when the constable forced it open, the room was found empty. No broken window, no displaced furniture, no sign of escape, only a hastily folded nightdress upon the bed, the impression of a head upon the pillow, and the faintest trace of perfume in the air. Miss Marple was among those permitted to enter later that day. The small chamber felt close and airless, though the casement window was shut tight. Rain ran in rivulets down the panes, and the view gave onto nothing but the orchard, sodden and deserted. The wardrobe door stood ajar, displaying a neat row of garments. A pair of shoes was aligned beneath, though Miss Marple noted the absence of the black leather pair Helena often wore when walking into the village. On the dressing table lay a silver-backed brush with a few dark hairs, and beside it a small bottle of pills, prescribed no doubt for Helena's weak heart. "Nothing taken," declared Inspector Crail, a stout man with a voice of unnecessary authority. "She must have slipped out somehow. Women can be resourceful." Miss Marple looked at him mildly, her head tilted. "Indeed, Inspector, but in my experience, even the most resourceful women cannot pass through locked doors." The remark was met with a gruff cough, but her eyes had already moved to the keyhole. The lock was of an older make, one that turned stiffly and had no duplicate commonly about. The key itself was still inside, lying upon the carpet just beneath the escutcheon. Miss Marple stooped to examine it. The position suggested it had fallen after being turned, though whether from within or without was not immediately apparent. "It is curious," she murmured, half to herself. "One is reminded of Mrs. Ludlow in the village, her habit of locking herself in each night, and how the neighbors thought her ghostly when she was found outside at dawn." until it was discovered, of course, that her nephew had mastered the art of sliding the key out with a wire. Inspector Crail harumphed, but took note nonetheless. Miss Marple's mind, however, was not upon tricks with wires. She had observed something subtler, a faint smear upon the inside of the window latch, as though from damp earth transferred by careless fingers. It could easily be overlooked, but to her it was as telling as a confession. Someone had opened that window, however briefly, and wiped it clean after, though not quite clean enough. Later, seated in Helena's drawing room with Clara weeping into a handkerchief, Miss Marple listened carefully to the maid's account of the previous evening. Clara admitted she had heard the low murmur of voices, like folk quarrelling, "Miss," before the crash of the vase. Yet she could not identify the other speaker. Fear had rooted her to the landing, she claimed, until the silence became unbearable. She confessed also to having noticed a gentleman loitering by the orchard gate a few days before. A tall one, sharp in the face, with eyes that made you look away quick, she said, shivering. I told Mrs. Partridge, but she only said it was nonsense. Miss Marple regarded her with sympathy, but her keen gaze did not miss Clara's hesitation when asked whether her mistress had enemies. Clara's eyes darted toward the writing desk, then away again. Clearly, there was more she dared not say. The inquest into the matter was set in motion. Though without a body, the villagers whispered of elopement, of sudden flights to London, even of suicide. But Miss Marple knew that Helena Partridge was not a woman who would vanish willingly, nor leave her house unlocked and her affairs in disorder. Her heart told her there was something more sinister at play, and her experience confirmed it. On the third evening after Helena's disappearance, Miss Marple received a visit from Leonard Graham, the solicitor who had managed Colonel Partridge's estate. He was a nervous fellow, thin and balding, with a habit of polishing his spectacles when anxious. He confessed to Miss Marple, in the privacy of her parlour, that Helena had recently approached him about altering her will. She wished, he said, voice low, to leave a considerable sum, not to her relations, but to a certain foundation in Cairo. It seemed odd, given her late husband's past dealings. She would not say more, only that she had been threatened, and that the change must be made quickly. Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-row. Threatened, you say? By whom? Mr. Graham swallowed. She would not tell me, only that an old debt had come due, and that she feared a reckoning. She pressed me to keep it confidential. I fear I may have delayed too long. The solicitor's revelation added weight to Miss Marple's earlier suspicions. A will, a debt, a foreign foundation, and now a locked room that yielded no body. Piece by piece, a picture was forming, though the outlines were blurred. That same night, when the rain once more lashed against her window panes, Miss Marple dreamed fitfully of Helena's frightened eyes and of the phrase that had lingered since the mysterious visitor, "The vase holds more than flowers." She woke with a start, struck by the recollection of the fragment Clara had found among the ashes. The words, "deliver before it is too late." It was not a threat, she realized, but an instruction. Something meant to be handed over, perhaps hidden in that very vase. And if Helena had burned the letter unfinished, then perhaps she had not destroyed the rest. The next day, Miss Marple contrived a reason to call once more at Partridge House. The constable allowed her into the drawing-room, where the broken vase had been swept into a box. She asked, with her usual air of innocent fussiness, to see the fragments. To the constable, it was nothing but rubbish, yet she handled them with reverence. Among the shards, she found one piece that had escaped notice. The base, thicker than the rest, and hollowed within. Clearly the vase had indeed concealed something, and in the crevice of that hollow, lodged tightly, was the corner of another folded page, damp and illegible, save for a single line in bold black ink. The Colonel betrayed us all. Her heart quickened. Whatever secret Helena had feared was tied to her husband's past, and it was a past that had followed her home from Cairo to this quiet English village. That evening, as Miss Marple recounted her discovery to Raymond over tea, she remarked in her mild tone, "You see, dear, people are so often careless when hiding things. They rely upon secrecy, yet forget that even the most decorative object may betray them if one looks closely enough. Now, if one wished to silence Mrs. Partridge, one would need to reach her before she revealed what she had hidden. And what better method than to create the illusion of impossibility? A locked room, a vanished widow, it makes for gossip and confusion, while the true purpose lies in what she might have carried away with her." Raymond, unsettled, asked, "Do you mean she is dead, Aunt Jane?" Miss Marple looked into the fire, her expression grave. "I mean only that Helena Partridge has been removed from the stage. Whether she still lives is known only to her captor, but I do not doubt that the locked door was meant to mislead us, to suggest despair or flight. In truth, I fancy the clue lies elsewhere. One must look for a person who had both motive and the skill to work such a trick." As she spoke, her mind returned to Clara's account of the gentleman with piercing eyes. He might be the same who had called on Helena that first night, speaking of debts and vases. If so, then he had returned to claim what he believed was his. But how had he gained entrance without the maid hearing? And why lock the door behind him? The answer came in a flash, as Miss Marple remembered the smudge upon the window latch. The room had been locked from within, but the window had been opened, briefly perhaps to admit an accomplice, or to remove Helena herself. A skilled hand could easily push the key out with a wire and draw it through beneath the door, then lock it again from the outside before slipping away into the orchard. It was not magic, but calculation. Her suspicions were confirmed the next morning when a village boy, eager to earn a shilling, brought to her a curious item he had found near the orchard hedge, a length of fine wire, bent at one end into a hook. Miss Marple rewarded him handsomely and kept the wire, turning it over in her fingers with quiet satisfaction. When she showed it later to Inspector Crail, he frowned, but could not dispute its significance. So they locked the door behind them to make it seem she'd vanished. But why? "Why, Inspector?" said Miss Marple gently. "Because nothing baffles quite so much as an impossible disappearance. And when people are baffled, they cease to ask the simpler questions, such as who gains by Mrs. Partridge's absence." Her words lingered in the inspector's mind, though he pretended otherwise. That night, as the storm finally cleared and a cold moon shone over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting forgotten. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly aligning: the visitor's warning, the will, the vase, the locked room. Yet one piece remained missing: the true motive that bound them all. She suspected it lay in the Colonel's past dealings, and in whatever Helena had feared might come to light. Her eyes drifted to the scrap of paper hidden in her knitting basket, the one pried from the vase's base. "The Colonel betrayed us all." The words were damning, but incomplete. Whom had he betrayed, and to what end? Until that was answered, the shadow hanging over the widow's fate would remain. And then came the knock at her door, gentle but urgent. She rose to find Clara on the threshold, her face ashen. In her hand, she held a folded envelope, addressed in Helena's own hand and sealed with wax. "I found it," Clara whispered hoarsely, "in the hem of her nightdress, where she must have stitched it herself. I daren't open it, but I thought you should see." Miss Marple took the envelope with steady hands, her eyes narrowing at the handwriting. She recognized it at once. Not Helena's usual careful script, but a hurried, almost disguised version, the kind of hand one uses when in fear. She turned it over, noting the faint imprint of a foreign crest on the paper. With the smallest of smiles, grim and satisfied, she knew that inside this letter lay the key to Helena's fate. The chapter closes with Miss Marple holding the unopened envelope to the lamplight, her knitting needles abandoned beside her, and the storm clouds parting, at last to reveal a cold, watchful moon. The words within would alter everything. Chapter 3. The Letter That Arrived Too Late. It was near midnight when the knock came at Miss Marple's cottage door, sharp and hurried, as though the caller feared both to linger and to depart. Jane Marple, who was never truly asleep in times of village unrest, slipped from her chair with surprising swiftness for a lady of her years. She opened the door to find the village postboy, his cap askew and his cheeks reddened from the cold night air. In his trembling hand, he held an envelope, the seal, cracked as though it had already travelled too far and endured too much. "Beg pardon, miss," he stammered. "This were found at the sorting office. Must have been put aside by mistake. Addressed to Mrs. Partridge it is, though she ain't in no position to receive it, is she?" Miss Marple took the letter with grave composure, her fingers brushing the roughened paper. It bore a Cairo postmark, its corners smudged and travel-worn. "Thank you, Henry. You've done very well. Run along home before your mother frets." When the boy had gone, she stood beneath the glow of her lamp and studied the letter. The handwriting was bold and somewhat foreign, with a flourish to the capital letters. She did not open it at once, though her fingers itched to know its contents. Instead, she set it upon the table, beside the sealed envelope Clara had discovered hidden in Helena Partridge's nightdress. 2 letters, one concealed, the other delayed, one written in fear, the other in warning. The symmetry troubled her. At dawn, Miss Marple made her way to Partridge House, where Inspector Crail stood fuming in the hall, his boots leaving damp marks upon the tiles. He had little patience for what he called old women's gossip, but Miss Marple was not one to be easily dismissed. She placed the Cairo letter delicately upon the mantelpiece before him. "A communication meant for Mrs. Partridge, Inspector," she said quietly. "Arrived, alas, too late, but perhaps not too late for us." Crail snorted, but broke the seal. His eyes moved quickly across the page, his brows drawing together. He read aloud in a grudging tone, "Madam, your husband's debts remain unsettled. We cannot be expected to remain patient forever. If you persist in silence, we shall be obliged to act. Remember, the betrayal is not forgotten nor forgiven. Signed, a name I cannot decipher. Perhaps Monsieur Dufresne." Miss Marple's eyes glinted behind her spectacles. Debts, betrayal, a demand. It seems Helena's fears were justified, though I notice, Inspector, that the hand is not entirely unfamiliar. He looked at her sharply. "You've seen it before?" "Why, yes. In the fragment found within the vase. The same bold strokes, the same foreign flourish. Whoever sent this letter was in correspondence with the Colonel himself, and now their quarrel has descended upon his widow." Inspector Crail muttered something about foreign scoundrels and set about issuing orders to search the house again. But Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room, her eyes wandering to the writing desk where Helena had left her unfinished letter on that first night. The blotter lay there still. On a quiet impulse, Miss Marple lifted it to the light and smiled faintly at the ghostly impression upon its surface, words pressed hard enough to leave their trace. With the simple trick of holding thin paper across it, she coaxed forth the outline of the widow's final lines. I dare not say more in writing. The vase is my safeguard. If anything should happen to me, look there. It was confirmation of what Miss Marple already suspected. Helena had known she was in danger, and the vase had been her hiding place. Yet it also raised a new question. What had become of the missing portion of that hidden letter? The scrap she had recovered was damning, but incomplete. The rest must still be somewhere, unless it had been carried off by the intruder who staged the locked room illusion. That afternoon, the village found itself abuzz with another development. Leonard Graham, the nervous solicitor, was seen leaving the vicarage in some agitation. Miss Marple, never one to let such agitation pass unremarked, arranged to encounter him at the lane. She observed his pallor, the twitch of his fingers, and the way his briefcase bulged unusually. "My dear Mr. Graham," she said, all kindness, "one might almost think you were carrying the world upon your shoulders. Legal burdens do weigh heavily, I am sure." He hesitated, his spectacles fogging in the damp air. "Mrs. Marple, you are correct. I have received a document most alarming. It was delivered this morning with no signature, merely a note advising me to destroy all drafts of Mrs. Partridge's revised will on pain of consequences." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Ah, so there are those who would prefer the will remain unchanged. Who, pray, stands to benefit most if the widow's estate remains as it was?" Graham's Adam's apple bobbed. "Why, her husband's distant cousin, Mr. Lionel Partridge. You may have seen him, a man of rather extravagant tastes. He is the primary heir under the existing terms. Should the Cairo Foundation be written in, his inheritance would be cut in half." Miss Marple remembered Lionel, a broad-shouldered man with a handsome moustache and a taste for fast cars, recently returned to the village after years abroad. She had heard him in the inn, speaking loudly of horses and whiskey, paying for rounds as though money flowed unending. Yet beneath the jovial exterior she had glimpsed restlessness, even desperation. A man accustomed to plenty who feared the drying up of his stream. That evening, as rain lashed once more against the windows, Miss Marple received a second unexpected delivery. Clara, still pale and shaken, arrived at her door with trembling hands. "It came by post, miss," she whispered, "addressed to me, though I don't know why. I swear I never asked for such a thing." She produced a small envelope, unsealed, containing only a single line scrawled in haste. "Silence is safety. Speak, and you share her fate." Miss Marple examined the paper, noting the cheap quality, the hurried hand, not the same as the Cairo correspondent, but something local, hastily contrived. "Fear is a powerful silencer, my dear," she murmured. "But threats, you know, often reveal more than confessions." Later that night, Miss Marple sat alone, with both Helena's hidden envelope and the Cairo letter upon her lap. She had not opened the former, wishing to do so with proper witnesses present, but she studied the handwriting, comparing it to the inscription on the Cairo letter. The disguised script of Helena's note bore a resemblance to the legal documents she had once signed at the parish. Miss Marple's memory for such trifles was formidable. Helena had indeed written in fear, perhaps to conceal her hand, but it was hers nonetheless. It was then, in the silence, broken only by the ticking clock, that a sharp rap came upon her window. She started, then opened the door to find young Henry again, drenched in rain. He clutched a sodden envelope. "They said it were for Mrs. Partridge, miss, but the address was smudged. I thought best bring it here." She took it swiftly. The letter within, though water-blurred, was legible enough. "The ship docks on the 12th. If you do not deliver the papers by then, we shall come ourselves. Delay is dangerous. Do not think England is beyond our reach." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. The 12th was but 3 days away. Whoever wrote this intended to arrive in England, to claim what they believed was theirs. And Helena Partridge, poor soul, had tried to prevent it, only to be silenced before the deadline. At the inquest that followed, Lionel Partridge appeared in his most sombre attire, yet Miss Marple noted the flicker of irritation when the matter of the will was raised. He dismissed it with a shrug, claiming Helena was always nervous about something or other. Yet when asked of his own whereabouts on the night of her disappearance, he was vague, muttering of a drive to the next town and a convivial supper no one could confirm. His eyes, usually merry, avoided the gaze of Inspector Crail. Miss Marple listened, knitting steadily, her mind whirring. Lionel had motive aplenty, but she could not yet place him in the locked room. He might well have wished his cousin's widow gone, but the foreign letters told of a deeper thread, stretching far beyond village quarrels. Helena had been caught between two snares, the grasping hands of family and the shadowy debts of her late husband. It was the letter, though, the one Clara had brought, hidden in the hem of a nightdress, that Miss Marple finally opened that evening in the presence of Inspector Crail and Mr. Graham. The paper inside was brief, written in Helena's disguised hand. "If I vanish, know that the truth lies with the papers hidden in the vase. They concern not only Arthur, but others of high position. To reveal them may bring ruin, yet silence is death. I beg whoever finds this to act with wisdom." Inspector Crail puffed furiously on his pipe. "So we're chasing papers now, are we? Foreign debts, betrayals, some nonsense about high position. It sounds like melodrama." But Miss Marple's eyes were grave. "Not melodrama, Inspector. Desperation." Helena feared both exposure and silence, and she hid her knowledge in the only place she thought safe, until someone wiser in deceit removed it. There was silence in the room, broken only by the hiss of the fire. At last, Mr. Graham spoke, his voice tight. "If those papers exist, they must be recovered at all costs, not merely for Helena's sake, for others who may stand implicated." Miss Marple regarded him steadily, seeing the sheen of perspiration on his brow, a solicitor sworn to secrecy, yet clearly burdened with more than legal concern. She wondered, not without sympathy, whether Graham himself feared his name might appear upon those hidden pages. When she returned home that night, Miss Marple placed the letters together in her work-basket. The Cairo warnings, Helena's desperate note, the threats to Clara, all pointed to one thing: a reckoning fast approaching. The 12th loomed, and with it the arrival of those who claimed betrayal at Colonel Partridge's hands. But before she could ponder further, there came a sound at her own door, this time softer, almost furtive. She rose and opened it to find nothing but the night air. Yet at her feet lay a folded scrap of paper, weighted by a small stone. She bent and picked it up. The message within was scrawled in haste: "Do not seek the truth. The dead must remain buried." Miss Marple stood in her doorway, the paper trembling slightly in her hand, as the church clock struck midnight across the rain-slicked roofs of St. Mary Mead, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that Helena Partridge's disappearance was only the first act in a much darker play. Chapter 4. The Vanishing Heirloom. It was the sound of shattering glass that first disturbed the uneasy peace of the manor that night. Rain fell heavily upon the leaded windows, and the wind whistled mournfully through the old chimneys. But the sudden crash from the east wing was distinct enough to draw the attention of the few remaining guests. A servant hurriedly lit a lamp in the hall, her hands trembling, as she muttered that such noises were ill-omened in a house already touched by death. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting in hand, lifted her head at once, her pale blue eyes sharper than any storm could soften. She did not hurry, but there was a quickness to her that belied her age as she rose and followed the others towards the east corridor where the sound had come. The long passageway smelled faintly of damp and polish, the floorboards creaking underfoot. As they reached the door of Lady Havisham's private drawing-room, they found it half ajar, and within the faint glimmer of a fire was just enough to reveal disorder. A vase lay in glittering shards across the hearthrug, and one of the window latches hung loose as though wrenched open by force. But more alarming than broken porcelain or a rattling casement was Lady Havisham herself, standing stiffly before the display cabinet that dominated one wall. Her hand clutched the edge of the mahogany frame, her face deathly white, and her eyes transfixed upon the empty velvet space where a gleaming family heirloom had once rested, a necklace of emeralds and diamonds said to date back to Elizabethan times. "It is gone," she whispered hoarsely, and her voice carried a despair so real it silenced even the most curious tongue. "The Havisham heirloom. It has been stolen." There was at once a rush of movement, questions tumbling over one another. The butler swore the cabinet had been locked only that afternoon, and Lady Havisham herself insisted she had checked the jewels not 2 hours before. The windows were closed against the storm when she had left the room at dinner, and yet now, before every eye, the case stood open and bare, its lock splintered, its treasure vanished as though swallowed by the night. Miss Marple, calm as ever, stepped forward with her gentle precision. "If I may," she murmured, touching the broken edge of the lock. She bent low, peering at the splintered wood. "Not wrenched, I think, but picked. And not hastily either. See how the inner catch has been tampered with carefully, as though by one who knows the art." Colonel Redmayne, who had been standing protectively near Lady Havisham, puffed furiously on his pipe. "Housebreaker, eh? Must have crept in under cover of the storm. Devilish timing." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly. "But curious, don't you think, that the thief should know precisely where to go, precisely what to take, and do so in a house so much on its guard, since the tragedy of Mr. Lytton's death only 2 days ago?" That name hung heavy in the room, and a silence fell, for all present knew that Mr. Lytton's sudden collapse, at the dinner table no less, had not been altogether explained, and though the doctor had murmured of weak hearts, there lingered the unspoken suspicion of something darker. Now theft followed death, and suspicion swelled like the rain outside. The servants were summoned and questioned in turn. The housemaid swore she had passed the corridor at 8:30 and heard nothing. The footman claimed he had been fetching firewood in the kitchens at the time. Yet Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the maid a moment longer, not unkindly, but with a patience that seemed to see through the girl's nervous fidgeting. When Lady Havisham, distraught, begged for the constable to be sent for, Miss Marple quietly suggested waiting. "The storm has made the roads all but impassable tonight. By morning, perhaps, we shall know a little more ourselves." She turned to the others. "You see, the question is not only how the necklace was taken, but why and by whom, in this house, at this particular hour." Colonel Redmayne bristled. "Are you suggesting it was one of us, guests under this roof?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she resumed her knitting, her expression mild. "I never suggest, Colonel. I merely observe. And it does strike me as peculiar that the thief should break the case, yet leave behind several other valuable items. The silver snuff-box, the gold brooch, they are untouched. Only the necklace is gone. That is not the work of a common burglar, who would have taken whatever lay nearest to hand. That is the work of someone who knew what they wanted and meant to have it." At that, Lady Havisham swayed and clutched her throat, as though some memory or suspicion pricked at her heart. But she said nothing, only allowed herself to be led gently to a chair by her niece, Margaret Lytton, a pale girl with sorrow still etched upon her brow from the loss of her brother. Margaret's eyes, wide and watchful, met Miss Marple's for an instant, and in that look there was both fear and an appeal for understanding. The storm raged on, rattling the old windows, and the household dispersed uneasily, though none truly slept. Miss Marple herself remained wakeful, her thoughts busy with the curious selectiveness of the theft and the too timely shattering of a vase to rouse attention at the very moment discovery was inevitable. A distraction, perhaps, but by whom and for what purpose? Come morning, the constable from St. Mary Mead trudged up the muddy drive, his boots caked with wet earth. He listened solemnly, inspected the broken lock, made notes in his heavy hand, but confessed he was baffled. "Could be anyone," he said. "But no footprints out the window, see? Ground soaked, soft as butter, and not a mark upon it. So whoever came in that way must have flown." He chuckled awkwardly, then flushed under Miss Marple's serene gaze. "Not flown, Constable," she corrected gently. "Walked, most likely, from the other side of the door. For I believe the window was opened after the fact to suggest an entry that was never made." She pointed to the sill, where no raindrops had yet dried, though the storm had raged for hours. Had it stood open through the night, the carpet here would be wet, yet it is quite dry. No, our thief was already inside the house. That pronouncement brought unease afresh, and eyes darted from servant to guest, and back again. Colonel Redmayne muttered that it was preposterous. Lady Havisham looked stricken. Margaret pressed her handkerchief to her lips, and the maid, poor child, dropped her tray outright. Later that day, Miss Marple took her quiet walk through the garden, as she often did, and paused by the yew hedge where the servants sometimes lingered. There, half buried in the damp earth, she noticed something small, glinting faintly. She stooped and plucked it forth. A button, dark with mud, but bearing a crest. Not of the Havishams, but of another, old family, one whose fortunes had been entwined with theirs through rivalry and debt. She tucked it carefully into her reticule, her expression unreadable. At tea, Miss Marple turned the conversation artfully towards family matters, and Lady Havisham, though reluctant, revealed what had been whispered only in corners, that the emerald necklace was more than ornament. It had been pledged once as collateral in a desperate hour, and though redeemed since, there were those who still believed it should rightfully belong elsewhere. Old grudges, long simmering, might yet drive desperate hands. The day passed, and evening fell, and with it another shock. A letter, delayed by the storm, arrived at last from London. It was addressed to Lady Havisham, and bore the hand of her late solicitor. With trembling fingers, she opened it, and as her eyes scanned the page, she gave a strangled cry. For within was a warning, dated 2 days prior, that an attempt would be made to claim or steal the family heirloom by those who considered it theirs by right. The name signed at the bottom was one that made the entire household stir with alarm. Edward Lytton, estranged cousin, long absent and said to bear a fierce grudge against the Havishams for past injustices. Miss Marple, who had been watching closely, leaned forward with the faintest sigh. "So the letter arrives too late," she murmured, echoing her own earlier suspicions. She folded her hands serenely. Yet if Edward Lytton is indeed involved, then the theft is not only of jewels, but of vengeance. Her eyes moved over each face in turn, resting at last on Margaret, who sat rigid, her eyes wide and her lips pressed tight, as though she fought against words that longed to escape. The chapter closed on that taut silence, with the stolen heirloom still missing, the letter's warning fresh in every mind, and the shadow of Edward Lytton now cast darkly across the manor. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but in her heart she knew the theft was but another thread in a pattern far more intricate, and the truth, when it emerged, would bind theft, death, and family grievance together in a web that none could easily escape. And then, as the clock chimed midnight, a servant burst in breathless, stammering that something else, something far more terrible, had just been found in the library. Chapter 5. Shadows in the servants' quarters. The rain had not ceased all night, and by the time dawn crept over the roof line of Gransby Manor, its dripping eaves and sodden lawns gave the house the look of something besieged. Inside, a restlessness lingered from the previous evening's discovery, the missing heirloom, and a quiet unease threaded through the servants as they moved in hushed tones about their duties. It was not merely the damp that chilled the air, but the sense that the house itself kept secrets too tightly clenched. Miss Marple, having spent the night at the manor at Lady Harrowden's invitation, sat at the breakfast table with her delicate hands folded in her lap. Her eyes were sharper than her frail frame suggested, and she observed not the silver teapot nor the toast, but the faces that betrayed more than words. A servant girl, Margaret, entered with a tray. Her eyes flicked nervously toward Lady Harrowden, and her hands trembled just enough to rattle the silver spoons against the china. It was small, but to Miss Marple, nothing small was ever meaningless. "Such dreadful weather," Lady Harrowden murmured, stirring her tea with unnecessary vigor. Her voice was flat, distracted. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied softly, "and yet perhaps fortunate, for rain has a way of revealing what one might rather wish concealed. Footprints, for instance, seldom keep secrets." Her words, light and seemingly idle, made Margaret pause in the doorway before she excused herself. Hurriedly, Miss Marple's pale eyes followed her retreat. It was mid-morning when the first real disturbance occurred. Sir Lionel, his temper never far from the surface, stormed into the drawing-room. "Blasted nonsense," he declared. "The emerald brooch could not have vanished into thin air. Either a thief entered this house last night, or—" He stopped, his eyes darting toward the hall, where Margaret could be heard, whispering with another maid. "Or else someone within these walls is lying." Words settled heavily. Miss Marple sat quietly knitting, her needles clicking, though the yarn was untouched by any visible pattern. She watched Sir Lionel's flushed face and considered his bluster, noting how swiftly his suspicion had fallen upon the staff. Men like him, she thought, often shouted loudest to drown out their own doubts. The afternoon deepened into gloom as the rain persisted. A peculiar draught crept through the upper corridors, carrying with it the scent of damp stone. Missy Marple, guided by a kind of instinct she seldom explained, wandered from the comfort of the drawing-room into the servants' wing of the house. Few of the gentry ventured there unless compelled, and it was here, in the narrow corridors with their peeling wallpaper and creaking floorboards, that truths often lingered in whispers and half-glimpsed shadows. She paused at the door of a small room, scarcely larger than a cupboard, its single window clouded by condensation. Inside, Margaret was seated on the edge of her bed, her hands clasped tightly over something wrapped in a cloth. At the sound of Miss Marple's soft cough, the girl sprang to her feet, colour rushing to her face. "Oh, miss," she stammered, I didn't hear you coming." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Few do, my dear. I was wondering if the rain disturbed your rest. It has a way of tapping one awake, like fingers upon a door." Margaret's hands tightened on the cloth, and Miss Marple's gaze fell to it, without appearing to. "You seem troubled," she continued gently. "It's always so much worse to bear alone. I've found that secrets weigh less when shared, though perhaps one must choose carefully with whom to share them." The girl's eyes brimmed with tears. "I've done nothing wrong, miss, but, oh, I daren't speak. They'd cast me out without a reference, and then where should I go?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "You needn't say more than you wish. Only know that lies often grow heavier than the truth, and sometimes the truth, however sharp, cuts us free." Margaret's lips parted as though she might confess, but footsteps approached down the corridor. Hastily, she shoved the wrapped object beneath her pillow. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bristow, appeared in the doorway, her eyes narrowing. "Miss Marple, the mistress requests your presence." The moment was lost. Margaret lowered her gaze, her body taut with fear, and Miss Marple allowed herself to be led away. But in her mind, the shape of the cloth bundle lingered, too soft to be the brooch itself, perhaps papers or a letter. And letters, Miss Marple knew, could undo more lives than jewels. That evening the household gathered again in the drawing-room, the fire sputtering against the damp. Tension clung to the air, each family member and servant casting furtive glances at one another. Sir Lionel prowled restlessly, while Lady Harrowden dabbed at her temples with a handkerchief. In the corner, Margaret stood pale and silent, her eyes fixed on the carpet. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively with her knitting, studied the scene with quiet precision. She noticed how Sir Lionel's voice always grew harsher when the conversation drifted near financial matters. She noted how Lady Harrowden's hand shook whenever the heirloom was mentioned, as though the object carried some weight of memory she dreaded. And she observed Margaret again, her lips pressed tight, as though she held back words that might burn her tongue. When at last the family retired, Miss Marple did not seek her chamber. Instead, she slipped softly back into the servants' quarters, guided by the faint glow of a lantern. She found the door ajar, shadows shifting within. From the darkness came a hushed exchange. "You mustn't keep it here, Maggie. If they find it—" "They won't," Margaret whispered fiercely. "I only want to be sure. It's the truth, isn't it? It proves what I said." The other voice, a man's, low and urgent, replied, "It proves too much. Burn it, for your own sake." There was a sudden silence as Miss Marple let the door creak purposefully, giving them warning. When she entered, only Margaret remained, pale and trembling, the cloth bundle once again clutched in her arms. My dear, Miss Marple said softly, whatever you hold, do take care. Fire may destroy paper, but not always the truth it carries, and secrets hidden in shadows seldom remain there for long. Margaret looked as though she might faint. At last, with a strangled sob, she thrust the bundle toward Miss Marple. I can't keep it, miss. You take it. You'll know what to do. Unwrapping the cloth with delicate fingers, Miss Marple revealed not the emerald brooch, but a folded letter, its ink smudged with age and damp. The handwriting was elegant, unmistakably belonging to Lord Harrowden, deceased these many years. She read only the first lines before folding it back, her eyes sharp. It was enough to know why Margaret trembled, for the letter spoke of money owed, of promises unfulfilled, and hinted at a betrayal within the family itself. Such a document could shift suspicion, motive, and perhaps inheritance. She raised her gaze to Margaret. This child may not be the brooch, but it is a jewel of another sort, one capable of cutting deeper than emeralds. Margaret nodded miserably. I didn't mean to pry. It was slipped behind the wainscot in my room. I found it only last week. Miss Marple's lips curved in a thin smile. Then I fear someone wished it to remain, forgotten. But secrets have a curious way of seeking the light, rather like bulbs beneath soil. They must push upward, sooner or later. She tucked the letter safely into her sleeve. You have done the right thing. As she made her way back toward her room, the corridor seemed longer, the shadows deeper. Somewhere behind her, the low murmur of that man's voice returned briefly before fading into silence. Whoever he was, he had not wished the letter preserved, and that, Miss Marple reflected, might be more telling than the letter's contents themselves. She reached her chamber, shut the door, and unfolded the paper once more by the dim glow of the lamp. The final line caught her attention most keenly. Should aught befall me, the emerald brooch shall serve as the token of my promise. It is not to leave this house. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The brooch and the letter were bound together, threads of the same mystery. The theft, she realized, was no random act. It was part of something deeper, something rooted in past debts and present fears. As the wind rattled the window panes and the rain lashed harder against the glass, she folded the letter with care, knowing that come morning the household's fragile calm would shatter. For in her possession now lay a clue so dangerous it might drive the thief, or the murderer, to desperation. And in the silent hours before dawn, Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting untouched as she considered who in the house feared the letter most. That answer, she knew, might lead her not only to the vanished heirloom, but to the heart of the darkness that had settled over Gransby Manor. When she finally laid her head upon the pillow, it was with the certainty that the shadows in the servants' quarters were not merely shadows at all, but watchful eyes, and that the next move in this sinister game would come swiftly. For secrets, once disturbed, never rest quietly again. And as the clock struck 3, somewhere in the silent house, a door creaked open. Chapter 6. The Will That Was Never Signed. The rain had begun before dusk, and showed no intention of relenting. Sheets of water lashed against the tall windows of Greystone Manor, and the old house seemed to groan beneath the weight of the storm. Inside, the inhabitants were gathered in the drawing-room, though it was not convivial company, but rather a tense vigil. The death of Colonel Redmayne had cast a shadow across every polished surface, and now, on this tempestuous evening, that shadow deepened with an unexpected revelation. It was Mr. Alfred Blackwood, the family solicitor who had been summoned at last to produce the colonel's will. He sat primly at the mahogany table, spectacles perched on his nose, his hands as careful as a surgeon's as he withdrew the document from his leather case. His voice, usually composed, faltered just enough to betray unease as he smoothed the sheets. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone carrying the weight of inevitability, "I regret to inform you that Colonel Redmayne's testamentary document, though drafted, was never completed. It lacks his signature." The words fell into the silence like stones into a pond, sending ripples through the assembled group. Eleanor Redmayne, the widow, let out a faint gasp, pressing her lace handkerchief against trembling lips. Maurice, the colonel's nephew, who had arrived so suddenly from London the week before, leaned forward in his chair, his eyes alight with something sharper than grief. Young Clara, the niece, looked confused rather than distressed, while Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, pursed her lips in a way that suggested she was holding back more than words. Miss Marple, seated near the fire with her knitting, did not look up immediately. One might have thought her indifferent to this shocking disclosure, but those who knew her well would have noticed the slight stilling of her needles, the faint narrowing of her eyes. To the untrained observer, she seemed an elderly lady, lost in her own gentle world, but she had already noted the sequence of reactions, who had gasped too quickly, who had not reacted at all. Maurice was the first to speak, his voice pitched too high. Surely there must be some mistake, Blackwood. The colonel spoke to me only last week of his intentions. He was quite clear on the matter of inheritance." Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat. "There is no mistake, Mr. Morris. The will is in my hand, drawn up to the colonel's dictation. But the document is not legally binding. Without his signature, the estate must pass according to the laws of intestacy." He paused, allowing the significance to sink in. "That, I am afraid, would leave the bulk of the property to his widow." The widow's face went pale, but not, Miss Marple noted, from any relief. If anything, there was dread in her eyes. It was Clara who whispered the words everyone else was thinking. "Then, someone has profited by ensuring it was never signed." The room seemed to shrink with the force of the accusation. The rain drummed harder against the windows, and somewhere in the depths of the house a door creaked, as though the manor itself were bearing witness. Miss Marple's mind turned quietly, carefully, as she looked at the document when Blackwood laid it flat upon the table. She leaned forward, peering through her spectacles. "Pardon me," she said in her gentle voice, "but may I ask, was the document kept securely before now?" Blackwood blinked at her, surprised at the intervention of the quiet old lady. "I had it in my office, Miss Marple. The colonel had promised to come and sign it only last Thursday. Circumstances, alas, intervened." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes on the sheet of paper. The edges were faintly smudged, as though handled by more than one set of fingers. The ink of the typed words was crisp, but she noticed a faint indentation near the bottom margin, an impression as though the pen had hovered, touched down, then lifted, again before a signature could be completed. She stored this detail away silently. Maurice rose, pacing the room like a caged animal. "It is absurd. The colonel was not negligent. He would not have failed to sign unless prevented." He shot a look toward his aunt, a glance laden with suspicion, poorly concealed. Eleanor turned upon him, her voice shaking but firm. "How dare you, Maurice? My husband's death has shattered me, and now you imply—" "Not I," Maurice interrupted. but the circumstances imply much. A will, unsigned, benefits one person alone. At that moment, Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, stepped forward, her hands twisting in her apron. "If I may, madam, sir, there's something I feel ought to be mentioned." Her eyes darted toward Miss Marple, as if seeking silent approval. The old lady gave a slight nod, encouraging. Mrs. Finch drew a deep breath. "On the night before the Colonel passed, I saw him go into his study after dinner with papers in hand. He looked most determined, but when I brought him his brandy an hour later, the papers were gone. He told me quite distinctly, that he would settle it tomorrow. 'Tomorrow will see everything set right,' he said." She swallowed. But there was no tomorrow for him. A hush followed this revelation. The storm seemed to rage louder, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Strange," Miss Marple said quietly. "Strange that a man so exact, so methodical as the Colonel should put off a matter so important. Men of order rarely leave things unfinished unless compelled by interruption." Mr. Blackwood frowned. "Do you suggest, Miss Marple, that someone prevented him?" She smiled faintly, her needles resuming their soft clicking. "I should not like to make suggestions just yet, but I do wonder, Mr. Blackwood, if the paper was always as we see it now. Sometimes, you know, things vanish and reappear, a little altered, a childish trick, often, but one sometimes found in more serious company." The solicitor looked scandalized, but Maurice's eyes gleamed. "You mean forgery or tampering?" Miss Marple gave a mild shrug. "I merely observe, dear sir, but perhaps you will allow me to study the indentation at the bottom of the page. It looks as though a pen touched it, perhaps even began to form a letter. The hand can hesitate, but it is unusual for a man to abandon his signature once begun." Blackwood examined it under his glass and gave a startled grunt. "By Jove! You are correct. There is the faintest curve, like the beginning of an R. He must have started and stopped. Or," Miss Marple said softly, "been stopped." The silence was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Eleanor clutched her handkerchief, eyes darting from face to face. Maurice's jaw tightened, as though he relished the drama, while Clara looked lost in confusion. Mrs. Finch's gaze remained fixed on the widow, an expression unreadable. The night grew darker still, lamps burning low. When at last the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered. Behind, her hand brushing over the desk, she noted a faint smear of wax upon the surface, candle wax, dripped not from the lamp above, but from a taper carried by hand. She filed it away in her quiet catalogue of clues. Someone had been in that room at night, unseen, while the Colonel prepared to sign. As she left the drawing-room, she passed Mrs. Finch in the corridor. The housekeeper's face was pale, her eyes too bright. "I don't like it, ma'am," she whispered. "There's shadows in this house since the master died, secrets walking the halls, and not all of them friendly." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand upon hers. "Secrets do tend to walk, Mrs. Finch, but they do not walk forever. They always find themselves cornered in the end." That night, as the manor lay shrouded in storm and unease, Miss Marple sat by her window in the guest room, knitting forgotten in her lap. The threads of the mystery wove themselves together in her mind. The unsigned will, the vanished papers, the indentation of a signature interrupted, the candle wax. Someone had ensured the Colonel's last intentions were never fulfilled, and she suspected the answer lay not in legal technicalities, but in human frailty, greed, fear, desperation. The next morning, as the rain lifted, a new discovery sent fresh shockwaves through Greystone Manor. Mrs. Finch, cleaning the Colonel's study, found beneath the blotter a folded sheet of paper. Its edges were crumpled, as though hastily hidden, and the ink blurred with smudges. It was a note in the Colonel's hand, only half finished, and it read, "If anything should befall me before the signing, you must know." The rest of the sentence trailed off. The ink dragged as though the pen had been snatched from him mid-stroke. When this was brought to the drawing-room, all eyes turned to Miss Marple. She lifted the note delicately, studying it with her calm precision. Then she looked up at the assembled family, her expression grave but composed. "It seems, my dears," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "that Colonel Redmayne feared precisely what has come to pass. He left us this warning, and now we must ask, who in this house made certain his will was never signed, and why?" A collective breath seemed to tighten in the room. Eleanor swayed slightly, Maurice's fists clenched, Clara's lips parted in shock, and Mrs. Finch looked as though she might faint. Miss Marple folded the paper with infinite care. "I dare say," she added, with that deceptively gentle smile, "the answer lies closer than we think." And as the family absorbed her words, the storm outside gave way to an uneasy stillness, a silence heavy with the weight of revelation to come. For the unsigned will had opened not merely a legal tangle, but a doorway into betrayal, fear, and perhaps murder itself. The chapter closed with Miss Marple's eyes fixed on the fire, her needles silent, as she thought not only of the Colonel's unfinished words, but of the terrible certainty that the next piece of the puzzle would drag the truth into daylight. The letter, the candle wax, the broken signature, all fragments of a greater whole. And someone in that house knew far too well what the rest of the Colonel's sentence would have revealed. Chapter 7. A Whisper from the Dead. The storm broke without warning, shattering the night with sudden violence. Rain lashed against the tall windows of Fairview Manor, wind rattled the shutters, and distant thunder rolled like the growl of some awakened beast. It was in this tumultuous hour, when the household had retreated to uneasy silence, that Miss Marple heard the sound, a low murmur, half-whisper, drifting along the corridor outside her guest room. It might have been mistaken for the moan of the wind, yet something in it struck a human chord. Words faintly discernible, though not in the voice of anyone she knew. She rose quietly, wrapped her shawl about her shoulders, and opened the door a crack. The passage lay empty, shadows darting under the flickering sconces, and the only movement was the quiver of a curtain drawn by a draught. Yet she could have sworn she heard, distinctly, the hushed phrase, "He never signed it." The whisper's uncanny timing struck at the heart of all that had plagued Fairview Manor these last days, the unsigned will of Colonel Barrow, his sudden death, and the quarrels over his estate. To hear those words now, spoken when no one should be abroad, was more than coincidence. Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes adjusting to the gloom, and saw that the sound seemed to come from the direction of the servants' staircase, the very quarters where secrets seemed to linger like smoke. She stood perfectly still, listening. A floorboard creaked, not far below, and then silence. The following morning, when the storm had abated and a pale sun struggled through the dripping branches, the household gathered in the breakfast room with red-rimmed eyes and sharp tongues. Tension ran high between Mrs. Amelia Barrow, the widow, who maintained an air of fragile dignity, and her stepson, Leonard, whose dark temper betrayed impatience with decorum. The unsigned will loomed over every exchange like a spectre, for without it, Leonard stood to inherit nearly everything, while Amelia, so recently married to the Colonel, would be left at the mercy of his grudging generosity. It was Leonard who, with a sneer, declared, "A pity father dallied so long with his pen. He made his intentions clear, but intentions count for little in law." Miss Marple, sipping her tea, glanced at him over the rim of her cup. "Intentions, Mr. Barrow, are curious things," she murmured. "They linger in the minds of others, sometimes even beyond." He looked at her sharply. "What exactly do you mean by that?" "Oh, nothing more than observation," she said mildly, "though I dare say one sometimes hears echoes where others hear only silence." She let her eyes rest momentarily on Amelia, who shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. Later that morning, Miss Marple found herself in the library, a cavernous chamber where books lined the walls and the hearth gave little warmth. The housekeeper, Mrs. Price, had come in search of misplaced ledgers, muttering about disordered shelves. Miss Marple, with her unobtrusive curiosity, noticed a folded slip of paper protruding from a volume of sermons. She drew it forth delicately, glancing at the faded script. It was a note in Colonel Barrow's hand, unmistakable in its slanting firmness. The message, however, was incomplete. "To be executed at once. My will." And then the sentence broke, as though interrupted mid-thought. The date placed it a week before his death. "Strange," Miss Marple said, softly slipping the paper back, "that a man so deliberate in habit should leave his affairs in such disarray." Mrs. Price sniffed. "Strange indeed, madam, though the Colonel had many distractions of late, quarrels with the young master and that new solicitor he took on. I never trusted him, for all his smooth ways." That afternoon, Miss Marple took her customary walk in the garden, the damp paths fragrant with rain. It was there she encountered Clara, the maid, pale and restless, her apron still damp from laundering. Clara hesitated before speaking, then blurted out, "Ma'am, you didn't hear anything last night, did you? I thought I heard someone whispering in the corridor, but when I looked, no one was there." Miss Marple regarded her with gentle steadiness. "You are not mistaken, my dear. I too heard a voice, and I think perhaps you know more of it than you care to admit." Clara flushed deeply. "It wasn't me, I swear. But sometimes I think the Colonel's ghost walks. More than once I've heard footsteps where there should be none." Miss Marple laid a hand on her arm, reassuring. "Ghosts, my child, are seldom what they seem. They often wear the cloaks of the living." That evening, as the household assembled for dinner, the storm's remnants brought an uneasy stillness. Leonard brooded at one end of the table, Amelia at the other, her gaze avoiding his. Conversations stumbled. Only Miss Marple seemed calm, observing each expression, every flicker of unease. Midway through the meal, a commotion arose in the servants' passage. The butler entered, pale as chalk, holding a torn scrap of envelope. He explained he had discovered it, hidden beneath the floorboards in the servants' quarters. The envelope bore the Colonel's seal, though ripped open. Inside had been a letter, but its contents were gone. Only one line remained, half torn but legible. "You must not delay any longer. Sign before it is too late." A murmur of shock passed around the table. Leonard scoffed, loudly. "Another ghostly warning, no doubt. Convenient that it comes to light now, when the ink has never touched the paper." Miss Marple, however, was intent on the handwriting. "Interesting," she said quietly. "The hand that addressed this envelope was indeed the Colonel's. Yet the tear here is deliberate. not accidental. Someone wished this message hidden until after his death. Mrs. Amelia rose abruptly, her composure cracking. Why must we rake over these dreadful things? My husband is gone, and with him all certainty. Must we torment ourselves with half-letters and whispers? Her voice trembled, but Miss Marple noted the glint of something else, fear perhaps, or guilt, behind her distress. When at last the company dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room, gazing into the fire. She pieced together the clues with quiet precision. The whisper, in the night, repeating the phrase, he never signed it. The unfinished note in the library. The torn envelope, urging haste. All pointed to a simple fact. The Colonel had meant to alter his will, but someone had ensured he never did. The motive was obvious, but the method, that was yet obscured. And the whisper, whether human mischief or something darker, served as a chilling reminder that the dead, if not truly speaking, could still make their voices heard through traces left behind. It was near midnight when Miss Marple, restless in her bed, heard the sound again, a low murmur drifting from the servants' quarters. She rose swiftly, candle in hand, and made her way through the darkened corridors. The stairs creaked, the air smelled of damp wood and old coal. She paused outside the narrow passage, listening. This time, the words were clearer, almost desperate. The key, the drawer. Then silence. She pressed forward, but the corridor lay empty. Only a draught stirred the curtain. Returning to her room, Miss Marple sat down heavily, her mind alive with speculation. If the Colonel had hidden something in a drawer, a key might yet reveal it. Tomorrow, she would search more carefully. But tonight, she could not shake the chill that the whisper left behind, as though a hand from the grave had brushed against her shoulder. And thus the chapter closed on a silence filled with menace. For in the morning, Miss Marple would discover that the drawer of the Colonel's writing desk had indeed been forced, and its contents removed. But not before she had glimpsed, tucked in a forgotten corner, a small shred of paper bearing the Colonel's hand. On it, faint but unmistakable, were the words, "For Amelia. Everything." Miss Marple folded the scrap carefully, her eyes shining with quiet understanding. The will may never have been signed, but the truth was beginning to whisper through the silence, and someone in the house would have every reason to dread it being heard. Chapter 8. The Hidden Drawer in the Library. The storm had raged all evening, battering the leaded windows of Greystone Manor as though the heavens themselves sought entry. Within, the fire hissed and spat in the great library hearth, the smell of damp wool from discarded coats lingering in the air. Miss Marple sat quietly in a high-backed chair, her knitting resting in her lap, though her pale blue eyes missed nothing. She had insisted on accompanying Inspector Graves back to the library after dinner, for she had noticed, in her mild way, that something about the room did not fit as neatly into its place as everything else in the house. The storm was nothing compared to the silent storm brewing within those walls, where secrets lay concealed, not in whispers, but in wood and dust. It was Colonel Whitcomb who, with a brandy glass in his hand and a tone of strained joviality, remarked upon the old oak writing desk in the corner. "My grandfather brought that back from Florence," he said, with forced cheer. "An antiquity, no doubt, though I imagine the drawers are full of nothing but moths and dust." His laugh was too loud, too eager to divert attention, and Miss Marple tilted her head just slightly, as though she had heard something unexpected in the cadence of his remark. The desk itself was a massive piece, its surface scarred by time, The wood darkened nearly to black. While the colonel spoke, Miss Marple quietly rose, smoothing her skirt, and drifted towards the desk. Her hand, fragile-looking but steady, traced the carving along the side. "Florentine," she murmured softly, "and quite clever craftsmanship, if I may say. You know, desks of this style often contained compartments hidden to all but the most observant." Colonel Whitcomb chuckled nervously, but his eyes darted just once to his sister-in-law, Mrs. Lydia Arkwright, who sat rigid on the settee. Lydia's long, pale fingers tightened around her teacup. She had been unusually silent throughout the evening, her beauty subdued by some inner agitation. Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly along the drawer edges, listening to the sound. A hollow resonance, faint but certain, drew her attention. She bent close, peering where the molding met the panel, and with a deft pressure, so gentle that it looked accidental, she pressed upon a carved rosette. There was a faint click, almost inaudible beneath the thunder's growl, and a thin drawer, scarcely the width of a hand, slid open. A hush fell across the room, the fire's crackle suddenly sounding indecently loud. Inside the drawer lay a sheaf of papers bound with a faded ribbon, and beneath them an envelope bearing the unmistakable crest of the Arkwright family. Inspector Graves leaned in, his brows lifting. "Well, Miss Marple, you've outdone us." Miss Marple did not smile, though her eyes gleamed with quiet triumph. "Not at all, Inspector. It is simply that one has seen such desks before. Men who conceal documents seldom rely upon locked drawers alone." She stepped back to let him examine the contents. The inspector untied the ribbon, revealing what appeared to be a collection of letters, some written in a woman's delicate hand, others in a bolder, masculine script. The most recent bore the date of only a week past. He frowned, reading swiftly, then looked up, his face grim. These speak of debts, considerable debts, and," he paused, lowering his voice, "a plan to contest the ownership of Greystone itself. And this envelope," he lifted it carefully. "It bears no address, only the name, Eleanor." At this name, a shiver ran through the room. For Eleanor was not a living woman, but the deceased matriarch, whose sudden death had precipitated the present turmoil. Lydia rose abruptly, her cup clattering onto the saucer. This is an outrage. Those papers are private, family matters. You have no right." But her voice faltered, for the truth of her alarm was plain to all. The colonel's ruddy face had drained of color, and he looked at her with a mixture of anger and something darker, fear. Miss Marple's gaze softened as she watched them. The quiet dramas of human nature were never so distant from her as the thunder rolling outside. "I wonder," Miss Marple said gently, "if Mrs. Arkwright might explain how these letters came to be concealed here. For if they are truly of no consequence, why hide them in a place so secretive? A mere locked drawer would have sufficed, had they been innocent." Lydia sank back onto the settee, her hands trembling. Her voice, when it came, was low, almost inaudible. "Eleanor, she was not as simple as you all thought. She suspected that the colonel had been gambling away the estate funds. She wrote me letters, pleas for advice. I told her she must make a new will, leaving Greystone safe for the children. She had it drafted, yes, but—" She broke off suddenly, as if she had said too much. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and yet sympathetic, did not waver. "But it was never signed," she said softly, recalling the whisper of gossip from the servants only a day earlier. "Eleanor died before she could secure the future of her grandchildren." And now the question arises, did she die naturally, or was her time hastened? The inspector's frown deepened. You mean murder? A fresh silence fell, thicker than before. The colonel banged his glass upon the mantelpiece. This is monstrous, to drag my late sister-in-law's name through such muck. Yet his hand shook as he poured himself another brandy. Miss Marple, however, was not watching him now. Her gaze was fixed upon Lydia, who sat pale and rigid, staring at the crackling fire as though she saw within it some dreadful vision. There was guilt in her eyes, yes, but also something else. A calculation. Miss Marple knew that look well, though few others would have recognized it. A woman weighing how much to reveal and how much to conceal. At that moment, the great clock in the hallway chimed the hour, its echo solemn. The storm seemed to ease, though the rain still whispered against the windows. Graves tucked the papers into his coat. These will be examined, he said firmly, and we shall see what truth lies in them. Miss Marple bent once more to the desk, running her hand along the narrow drawer. It is curious, she murmured. A hidden compartment is meant to preserve secrecy, yet inevitably it draws attention. I should say, Inspector, that whoever placed these letters here meant them to be discovered eventually, perhaps by the right eyes, or perhaps at the wrong moment. Her words hung in the air like smoke. Colonel Whitcomb muttered something incoherent, and Lydia pressed her handkerchief to her lips. The tension wound tighter, as though the very air might snap. And then Miss Marple noticed something small, so small that no one else would have thought it worth a second glance. A faint smear of wax along the edge of the drawer, pale and translucent. She leaned closer, her keen eyes narrowing. How very odd, she said softly. This wax, such as one might find upon the wick of a candle, and yet it seems too fresh for a drawer that has not been opened in years. Graves followed her gaze. You mean the drawer was opened? Recently? Quite so. Within the last day or two, I should think, Miss Marple replied. Her knitting lay forgotten, her face grave. Which raises the question, who opened it, and why did they choose to leave the letters inside, rather than remove them altogether? The colonel swore under his breath, pacing the hearthrug. Lydia's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Outside, the storm rolled on, a fitting accompaniment to the turmoil now consuming the house. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly, her voice calm, but carrying weight. It seems to me, Inspector, that Greystone Manor has more secrets than its walls can contain, and sooner or later, one of them will break free. The room breathed with unease. A draught stirred the curtains. The fire flared, and for an instant it seemed as though Eleanor herself lingered in the shadows of the library, whispering warnings from the grave. Miss Marple alone appeared untroubled. She glanced at the pale smear of wax again, her mind already weaving the threads. A drawer, a letter, a will unsigned, and now a mark too recent to be forgotten. The pattern was emerging, if one only had the patience to see it through. And with that quiet certainty, she knew the next revelation would not merely unsettle Greystone, it would shake the foundations of all who dwelt there. The wax glistened faintly, a clue left in silence, pointing forward into the darkness of what was yet to come. Chapter 9. The truth buried in the garden. The storm had rolled in, with a violence that made the very windows of Oldbridge Manor tremble in their frames. Rain lashed against the glass, as though the night itself were determined to wash away the secrets concealed within those ancient walls. The great chiming clock in the hallway had just struck midnight when the scream tore through the silence, a high, thin sound that carried up the staircase and through the panelled corridors like the cry of a lost soul. It was Mr. Giles, the gardener, who had stumbled in from the grounds. Dripping wet, his face pale as bone, clutching at his arm as if something far worse than mere rain had pursued him. "In the garden," he gasped, before collapsing into unconsciousness at the very feet of Colonel Redmayne. Miss Marple, seated quietly in a faded armchair by the fire, looked up with calm but sharp eyes. She had learned over many years of her gentle observations that chance seldom ruled the world in matters of life and death. If the gardener had dragged himself into the manor at such an hour, and with such terror in his voice, it was not mere fright, it was discovery. They carried Giles into the servants' hall, laying him on a long wooden table, while Mrs. Danforth, the housekeeper, wrung her hands and muttered prayers under her breath. Miss Marple, small and unobtrusive, followed with that peculiar lightness of step that made her seem more a shadow than a guest. As the housekeeper dabbed at Giles's forehead with a cloth, Miss Marple leaned closer, her eyes darting not at the man's ashen face, but at his hands. They were caked with wet soil, and beneath his broken fingernails were traces of something darker than mud, something that looked very much like old dried blood. The garden, he had said, and gardens Miss Marple well knew, were the most eloquent of witnesses. They kept secrets in their roots, their soil, and their silence. When Giles came to, it was not with clarity, but with a shudder. His lips trembled as he whispered, "It shouldn't have been there. God forgive me, it shouldn't have been there." His words were enough to stir unease in even the most hardened of souls. Colonel Redmayne snapped for brandy, though his own hands shook faintly as he poured it. An hour later, with the rain easing to a steady drizzle, a reluctant party made its way into the grounds. The garden stretched wide, a patchwork of manicured lawns and neglected corners where ivy and brambles had long taken charge. Giles had pointed them toward the far end, near the broken sundial, and then refused to say another word. Lanterns swung in the damp air, casting yellow circles of light upon the slick earth. It was there, beneath a freshly turned patch of ground, that the spade struck something unyielding. The men dug with mounting unease until the outlines of a box emerged, a wooden chest, old and warped, the brass clasps half-rotted. When the lid was prized open, the lantern light revealed not the treasure or trinkets one might expect, but bones, small, fragile bones, their whiteness ghostly against the damp wood. A child's remains. A gasp broke the night. Mrs. Danforth crossed herself feverishly, while Lady Caroline turned away, pressing her handkerchief to her lips. Miss Marple did not gasp, nor did she turn. She only bent slightly, her clear eyes peering into the chest, noting the fabric scraps clinging still to the bones, a strip of faded velvet, once rich and blue. It was not merely a body they had unearthed. It was a history, a forgotten chapter deliberately buried. Whispers swept through the household by morning. Whose child? Why hidden in such secrecy? And how did it connect with the recent murder that had already blackened Oldbridge Manor's name? Miss Marple, sipping her weak tea in the breakfast room, listened more than she spoke. She observed the pallor on Lady Caroline's cheeks, the anxious tapping of Colonel Redmayne's fingers on the table, and the studied silence of young Arthur Denham, who stared into his plate with too much intensity to be mere absent-mindedness. In the course of the morning, Miss Marple wandered into the library, a place she found most useful, for people often spoke more freely amongst books than in drawing-rooms. It was there she encountered young Arthur, who had been lingering by the window. His eyes darted toward her before quickly away. "It's a dreadful business," he said, attempting casualness, but the strain in his voice betrayed him. "Poor Giles. Finding that, one might think he'll never be the same." "One might also think," Miss Marple said gently, "that such discoveries seldom come to light by accident. Earth that has been undisturbed for decades does not invite the spade without reason. Someone knew or suspected where to look. Someone set Giles upon it." Arthur's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a fleeting moment, fear flitted across his face. Then he attempted a laugh. "Superstition, perhaps. Old stories about the sundial, you know. The servants' gossip." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "servants' gossip, and very wisely too. Gossip is but the smoke. There is always a fire beneath." She let the words hang, and Arthur, unable to bear her gaze, excused himself with sudden haste. Later that day, Miss Marple took a quiet walk in the garden. The rain had left the ground soft, and the scent of wet earth clung in the air. She paused by the sundial, bending to inspect the disturbed soil. A woman unused to gardening might have thought the patch unremarkable now that it had been filled again, but Miss Marple saw more than soil. She saw the pattern of Giles's digging, his uncertainty, the way the earth at the edge bore different marks, as though someone else had disturbed it before him. The conclusion was plain. Giles had not stumbled upon the chest of his own accord. He had been led. That evening, in the servants' quarters, Miss Marple sat quietly as Mrs. Danforth poured out her anxieties. "It's the manor itself, ma'am. There's wickedness here, old wickedness. I told them years ago that part of the garden was wrong, but no one listens to a housekeeper." Her voice trembled. "And Mr. Arthur, he's not himself. He walks at night. I've seen him, though he'd deny it. Shadows moving through the corridors when honest folk are abed." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, her eyes thoughtful. "Sleepwalking is a curious affliction, Mrs. Danforth, and often more revealing than waking words. A guilty mind will rise when the body longs for rest. Tell me, was it near the library you saw him?" The housekeeper's eyes widened. "Yes, ma'am. Always near the library." It was the confirmation Miss Marple needed. A house might bury a body, but it seldom buried its secrets in only one place. That night, while the manor creaked and whispered under the weight of storm and silence, Miss Marple made her way softly into the library. The fire had burned low, and the scent of damp stone lingered. She traced her fingers along the paneling, her sharp eyes noting a faint discoloration where the wood did not quite match. Pressing gently, she felt the panel give ever so slightly. A hidden drawer. Inside lay a bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. The ink blurred with age, but the handwriting unmistakable. They were addressed to Lady Caroline, but not from her husband. They spoke of longing, of betrayal, of a child born in secrecy, a child who must never be acknowledged. Miss Marple replaced the letters with meticulous care, her mind racing not with scandal, but with sorrow. Here lay the truth of the bones in the garden. But as she stepped back, the faint creak of a floorboard behind her froze her in place. She turned slowly to find Arthur standing in the doorway, his face pale and drawn, his eyes burning with a mix of fear and desperation. "You shouldn't be in here," he said, his voice low. Miss Marple, calm as ever, regarded him kindly. "The library holds more than books, my dear. It holds the truth, and the truth, once buried, will always find a way to rise." Arthur's lips trembled, his hands clenching at his sides. "You don't understand. If it comes out, if any of it comes out, everything will be ruined. For all of us." Miss Marple tilted her head, her needles slipping back into her pocket. "On the contrary, young man, I think it is you who does not understand. Secrets are far more dangerous than the truth. For secrets, my dear Arthur, have a way of killing." The air between them grew thick, charged with unspoken dread. Then, without another word, Arthur turned and fled into the shadows of the corridor, leaving Miss Marple alone with the letters and the terrible knowledge they contained. She stood there a long moment, the whisper of the dead child's presence lingering like cold air about her, and as the clock struck 2, a sudden wind flung open the window, scattering papers across the library floor. Among them was a single sheet that must have slipped from the bundle, a page that bore not only handwriting but also a name. It was a name that tied the dead child to one still living, a name that, if revealed, would shatter the household to its core. Miss Marple stooped, her eyes narrowing as she read. Then she folded the paper neatly, slipping it into her sleeve. Chapter 10. The Trap Set at Twilight. The storm that had hung heavy over Stonygates all afternoon finally broke just as the sun began its descent, washing the estate in a bruised palette of purple and gold, the sky flickering with distant lightning. The air carried with it a sharp scent of wet earth and ozone, and inside the manor the household had drawn closer together, shadows stretching long in the fading light. It was in this uneasy hour, when day surrendered reluctantly to night, that Miss Marple chose to act, for twilight, she had often said, was when truths were most inclined to reveal themselves, when masks slipped, and the eye adjusted not to clarity, but to deception. The shocking discovery came not with blood, but with words. Inspector Cray, his coat still damp from the storm, arrived with a bundle of papers recovered from the study, papers which had been hastily stuffed into the hidden drawer discovered only 2 nights before. Miss Marple watched, her knitting set aside on her lap, as the inspector laid the pages on the long oak table. They were fragments of a draft, a will, half complete, unsigned. And yet it was not the absence of signature that made the room stir with unease, but the startling clause contained within it. The entire fortune, house, and grounds, left not to Mr. Harcourt's grieving widow, nor to his distant cousin Mr. Julian Drake, but instead to a most unexpected beneficiary, Lucy Harcourt, the young maid who had served the household in quiet obscurity. Gasps filled the air. Lucy herself, pale and trembling, looked as though she might faint. Mrs. Harcourt's lips tightened until they were bloodless, and Mr. Drake gave a dry, incredulous laugh that did little to mask the flicker of alarm in his eyes. It was Miss Marple, with her bird-like gaze and calm composure, who broke the silence. Unsigned though it may be, one cannot help but notice how very inconvenient this document might prove to some. The implication lingered, like smoke. Lucy stammered out a denial, insisting she had known nothing of it, that she had never spoken of inheriting so much as a trinket, and indeed, her wide, frightened eyes bore none of the calculation that Miss Marple so often noticed in guilty parties. Yet innocence was not easily proved, and the mere existence of such a will, hidden, incomplete, and unacknowledged, cast a long shadow across every soul in that house. It was then that Miss Marple began to weave her trap. She did not speak of it aloud, nor did she share her suspicions with the inspector. Instead, she observed, as she always did, the tiny cracks in each person's composure. Mrs. Harcourt's hand gripped the arm of her chair so tightly the knuckles whitened. Mr. Drake's manner grew overly jocular, a little too eager to dismiss the matter, and Lucy, though shaking with fear, kept casting her gaze toward the French windows that led out into the garden, as though she half expected some rescue, or perhaps some dreadful reappearance. Later, when the lamps had been lit and the storm rattled the panes, Miss Marple requested that the family gather once more in the library. "There are questions," she said gently, "that must be answered before night deepens too far. I should hate to think that twilight might allow certain unpleasantness to go unobserved." They came reluctantly. The servants muttered in the hall, uneasy with the tension that seemed to seep into every corner of the house. Miss Marple sat quietly in her chosen chair, knitting set once again in her hands, the steady click of the needles oddly steadying against the rising storm outside. It was she who guided the conversation, prodding with the gentlest of inquiries, the sort that seemed harmless until one realized how very pointed they were. "Mrs. Harcourt," she began, "you must have been surprised indeed to learn of such a draft, leaving all to Lucy. One wonders, did your husband ever speak of such a wish?" The widow's face hardened. "Never. He loved this house, our house. To think he would cast it away to a servant girl. Preposterous." "Perhaps not so preposterous as it seems," Miss Marple mused. "Men of strong conscience often act in unexpected ways when guilt or obligation touches them. Was there some matter, I wonder, in which Mr. Harcourt felt himself indebted to young Lucy?" The question struck deeper than it appeared, for Lucy let out a faint gasp, her hand rising to her mouth. It was not, Miss Marple noticed, the sound of a schemer, caught out, but of a girl who recognized a secret long buried. But she said nothing, and Miss Marple, wise enough to let silence do its work, turned her attention to Mr. Drake. "And you, sir? You were perhaps equally startled. I believe you once said you had an expectation, though faint, of course, that this estate might come to you one day." His smile was quick, a little too smooth. "I may have entertained the thought, yes. Who would not? But as you see, I am still quite alive without it." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, "and perhaps rather anxious that no one should suspect you might wish otherwise." The trap was slowly closing, though no one yet saw it for what it was. Miss Marple had chosen her battleground wisely. Twilight, with its mingling of light and shadow, when human nature was most inclined to reveal contradictions. Then came the first meaningful clue. As thunder rolled in the distance, Miss Marple bent to gather the draft papers and paused. Her sharp eyes caught it, immediately. The indentation of writing, not visible at first glance. Faint lines pressed into the parchment as though a sheet had once lain above it, and words had been written hard enough to leave their ghost behind. Holding the paper at an angle to the lamp, she revealed the shadowy scrawl. Only fragments could be made out. "Must not be found. Draw. Before Friday." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Inspector Cray leaned forward, brow furrowed. So someone used this paper. Someone who feared discovery. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "and someone who knew precisely where the drawer was hidden." Her eyes flicked, ever so briefly, to Mrs. Harcourt. It was not accusation, but suggestion, and it was enough to make the widow's lips tremble before she regained her composure. The second clue came minutes later, when Lucy, in her nervousness, dropped her handkerchief. Miss Marple stooped to retrieve it, and quite deliberately noted aloud the faint trace of ink along the edge, as though it had once been pressed against fresh writing. Lucy blushed scarlet, protesting that she had used it to blot a letter weeks before. Yet the mark was not mere ink, Miss Marple observed silently. It was the same shade and thickness as that on the ghostly words she had just seen. Still, she said nothing of it then, for the trap was not yet sprung. Instead, she let conversation drift, allowing accusations and half-truths to bubble forth. Mrs. Harcourt accused Lucy of deception. Mr. Drake hinted darkly that his cousin's mind had been failing and that Lucy had perhaps taken advantage. Even Inspector Cray, weary of evasions, began to mutter that the matter might require a full inquiry at the magistrates. And all the while, Miss Marple knitted, her needles clacking softly, her eyes as bright and sharp as any hawk. She knew human weakness as well as she knew her garden paths in St. Mary Mead, and she had set her stage for precisely this, to let the guilty soul betray itself in the half-light. It was not until the lamps flickered, dimmed by the storm outside, that she spoke again. "It seems to me," she said gently, "that we are confronted not by what the will says, but by what it does not say. A document unsigned tells us nothing certain, except that someone had reason to ensure it would never be signed at all. And perhaps that is where our murderer lies hidden." The words fell like a stone in water. Silence deepened. Every face was a mask of tension. And just then, as if fate itself sought to heighten the moment, lightning split the sky, flooding the library with a white glare. For an instant, Miss Marple's eyes caught the reflection of something metallic glinting at Mr. Drake's cuff. A key, a very particular key, for it matched the small brass lock Miss Marple had earlier observed upon the hidden drawer. When the light faded, she allowed herself only the smallest of smiles. The trap had been baited, and now she saw who was snared. But she did not reveal it. Not yet. Instead, she leaned back, her voice calm, almost soothing. "Yes, I think by tomorrow we may know more. But tonight, I advise we all remain close. Twilight has a way of luring secrets into the open." The storm raged on. The house creaked beneath its weight, and the household dispersed uneasily, each suspect now glancing sidelong at the other, wondering whose guilt had just been uncovered. Miss Marple remained in her chair a moment longer, knitting laid aside, her mind turning with quiet precision. She had seen enough to set her course. The truth was nearly within her grasp, and as she rose to retire, her eyes fell once more on Lucy, whose face was still pale and drawn, and who clutched her ink-stained handkerchief as though it were the last tether to her innocence. Miss Marple knew then that the next revelation would come not by stormlight, but in the clearer dawn that followed. Yet the trap she had laid at twilight would prove decisive. For in the library, the unsigned will and the ghostly words pressed into parchment whispered a truth, darker than inheritance or greed. Someone had killed not for gain, but for fear of exposure. And Miss Marple, with her inexorable patience, was already leading them, step by step, into the final snare. The chapter closed not with comfort, but with a sudden sound that froze Miss Marple in her tracks, a sharp knock upon the window pane, though no one stood outside in the storm. When the curtains were drawn back, a scrap of paper was found pressed to the glass, rain-smeared but legible still. In a hurried hand, it read, "Ask Lucy about the garden, before it is too late." Chapter 11. The Confession. No one heard it began on a night that seemed built for secrets. A mist had rolled in from the fields and hung low over the lanes of St. Alderney, and the rain, thin as needles, pattered upon the window panes of the great house where so much of the tragedy had unfolded. Inside, the air was heavy with tension, as though the very walls bore witness to words never spoken aloud. Miss Marple sat near the fireplace, her knitting in her lap, though her hands had stilled. The others in the drawing-room spoke in hushed tones. Sir Reginald, his voice stern but wavering, Lady Margaret, pale and distracted, Inspector Graves scribbling in his notebook with dogged determination. It was then that the butler, old Simmons, entered with a letter clutched tight in his gloved hand, his eyes darting nervously to Miss Marple as though he already knew that she, of all of them, would grasp its meaning. "The vicar brought this, ma'am," Simmons said, handing it to Lady Margaret. Though the paper seemed almost to burn her fingertips, she did not unfold it. Instead, her trembling hand passed it to Miss Marple, whose steady blue eyes studied the seal before she opened it. The ink was smudged, the handwriting erratic, but unmistakably familiar. It was George Felton's, the poor cousin who had been found dead in the orchard not 2 weeks before. And yet, the date on the letter was the very evening of his death. Miss Marple read in silence. The letter spoke of fear, of something he had witnessed, and of a secret he could not carry to his grave. But the final line chilled her most of all. "If I do not speak tonight, someone else will ensure the truth dies with me." A murmur rose around her, Lady Margaret clutching her pearls, Sir Reginald demanding to know how such a letter could appear now, and Graves muttering about forgery. Miss Marple, however, tapped the page with her finger. "The peculiar blotting here," she said softly. "It is not ink that has smeared, but candle, wax." He wrote this hurriedly, by candlelight, perhaps just before he intended to meet someone. And note, the second page is missing. It was torn away. They stared at her, but she did not look up, only folded the letter neatly. "A confession," she murmured, but one no one heard. That night, sleep eluded all within the manor. Miss Marple, however, lay awake, not from fear, but from thought. George Felton had been a weak man in many respects, fond of drink, prone to bitterness, but he had not been a liar. His words carried a weight that could not be dismissed, even if death had silenced his tongue, before he could utter them aloud. She rose early the next morning, long before the rain had ceased, and walked through the garden, her thin figure almost spectral in the grey light. She paused beneath the yew tree near the orchard, where George had been found. The damp earth gave off its chill scent, and she bent down, pressing her hand against the soil. It had been disturbed again, more recently than his burial. Someone had returned here under cover of darkness. By breakfast, the house was in further disarray. Inspector Graves had received word from the station that a villager claimed to have heard voices near the vicarage late on the night George died, raised voices, one male, one female. But the villager had been too far away to distinguish the words, and in the storm the sounds had carried strangely. Lady Margaret looked stricken at the mention of a woman's voice, and Miss Marple did not miss the brief flicker of fear in her expression. After the meal, Miss Marple quietly sought out young Alice Felton, George's sister. The girl had been withdrawn since the beginning, her eyes red from tears, yet her voice cold whenever her brother was mentioned. "Alice," Miss Marple said gently, as they walked along the corridor, lined with family portraits, "you never truly believed your brother's death was an accident, did you?" Alice stiffened, her gaze darting toward the nearest doorway, but she said nothing. Miss Marple's tone softened further. "You were fond of him once, despite everything. His mistakes, his disappointments, they did not erase the bond between you. And if you thought someone silenced him before he could tell the truth, you would want that truth known, would you not? Alice's lips trembled, but at last she whispered, "He told me nothing directly. But I know he had an argument with Lady Margaret the day before he died. He threatened to tell Sir Reginald something about father's will." Here was the thread, delicate but strong. Miss Marple nodded, her mind quickening. And yet the will, as it stands, was never signed. Alice's eyes widened. "You know?" "I suspect," Miss Marple said with a faint smile. "And when people are frightened of unsigned papers, it is because their fate rests upon what might have been written there." Later that afternoon, the storm gave way to a heavy stillness, the kind of oppressive silence that makes even small sounds seem thunderous. Miss Marple, with Inspector Graves reluctantly in tow, asked to see the library again. The great oak desk loomed at the center, its drawers neatly shut. She ran her thin fingers along the wood, pausing at the faint scratch marks near the base. "The drawer here," she said, "has been opened often, though the key is kept in Sir Reginald's possession. Unless, of course, there is another way." She pressed lightly against the side, and with a small click, a hidden compartment sprang open. Inside lay a crumpled piece of paper, browned at the edges, bearing George Felton's unmistakable scrawl. Inspector Graves whistled under his breath. "Another letter?" Miss Marple held it up. It was not a letter, but a fragment of the missing page, the continuation of the confession. He wrote of a meeting, arranged at twilight, in the garden, with one who feared the truth more than anything else. He did not name them. But he left this as a safeguard, tucked away where he hoped it might be found. She folded it carefully. And so, George did confess. Only no one was there to hear. As the day wore on, the atmosphere grew more strained. Lady Margaret withdrew to her room. Sir Reginald paced the hall with fury, and the servants whispered in corners. At dinner, Miss Marple's calm presence was a quiet anchor amidst the storm. She studied each face, each flicker of the eyes, the tremor in a hand lifting a glass. The guilty, she knew, often revealed themselves in the smallest betrayals of composure. It was nearly midnight when the house was roused again by a scream from the garden. They rushed outside with lanterns, and there, by the yew tree, Lady Margaret was found, collapsed, the earth disturbed beneath her hands as though she had been searching, clawing at the soil. In her fist was clutched a small silver locket, its chain broken. Inside was a miniature portrait of George Felton. Her voice broke in sobs as she cried, "I only wanted to keep it safe. I never meant," before she fell silent, swooning against her husband's arms. Miss Marple, bending over the locket, spoke quietly so that only Inspector Graves heard. "A keepsake, perhaps, but taken from George the night he died. That is why she returned here, again and again. A guilty conscience seeks to bury what cannot remain hidden." The inspector swallowed hard. "So she killed him?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Not so simple, Inspector. Not yet. Lady Margaret is not the type to soil her hands in violence. But she may know who did, and she may fear them still." The night ended with Lady Margaret confined to her chamber under watch, though Sir Reginald protested vehemently. The rain returned, beating against the windows with relentless persistence. Miss Marple sat once more in the drawing-room, her knitting untouched, her gaze on the flames. She could see the threads now, tangled but discernible. An unsigned will, a confession stifled, a woman who knew more than she dared admit, and a truth buried, perhaps quite literally, in the garden. She whispered softly to herself, "The dead do speak, if only one is willing to listen." And in that moment, the grandfather clock struck 1, the sound reverberating through the silent house. Miss Marple rose and approached the mantel, where she had earlier noticed a faint trail of mud. Dried now, but unmistakable. Someone had entered from the garden after midnight, not Lady Margaret, for she had been carried upstairs. Another was moving, unseen, through the house. She turned back to Graves, her eyes bright. The confession was silenced, but not entirely. George named no one, but his meeting at twilight tells us much. Tomorrow, Inspector, we must set our own trap at twilight and see who dares to walk into it. And with that, Chapter 11 closed upon a silence more oppressive than any storm, leaving the air thick with dread and anticipation, as though the very walls of the manor awaited the next revelation that must surely come. Chapter 12. The Secret Beneath the Staircase. The storm had not relented. Rain lashed against the tall windows of Ashgrove Manor, as though the night itself conspired to keep its secrets locked inside. Lightning flared, and for a moment the great staircase of the hall loomed like a skeleton against the dark, its banisters casting grotesque shadows on the walls. It was there, at the very base of the stairs, that Colonel Redstone had been found 2 evenings ago, his life snuffed out, his death a puzzle of motives and contradictions. Yet tonight, Miss Marple stood quietly in that very hall, her sharp eyes moving slowly across the floor, as if every creak of the old timbers whispered to her. It was not mere curiosity that had kept her awake at such an hour. She had long felt, though she had never yet voiced it, that the house itself was hiding something. A house as old as Ashgrove Manor often bore secrets as surely as its owners bore grudges, and the way the staircase shifted ever so, slightly beneath one's feet, the faint, hollow echo when the wood was struck, all of it suggested something concealed. It was this unease that had brought her down from her room with only a candle, listening to the voices of the storm and her own thoughts. The silence was suddenly broken by a sound, a muffled thump, as if something had fallen or been deliberately moved, not far from where she stood. She stiffened. "Who's there?" Her voice was calm, soft, not accusing, but curious. A figure emerged from the shadows near the library door. Inspector Graves, his wet coat clinging to him, as if he had just returned from outside. His face was drawn, troubled. "Miss Marple," he said with a start, "I thought everyone had retired." "And I thought you had gone back to your lodgings in the village, Inspector," she replied, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Curious, isn't it, how neither of us can quite seem to leave this staircase alone?" The inspector gave a small, grim smile. "You've noticed it, too, then? The hollow sound when you tread here, the odd way the wood doesn't quite fit. I've half a mind to rip the boards up tonight." "That might be unwise in the dark," Miss Marple said gently. "One must not forget, Inspector, that traps are often laid for the hasty, and secrets, once unearthed, cannot be so easily reburied." Even as she spoke, another sound drew their attention. Soft footsteps on the landing above, hesitant, retreating quickly. Both looked up, but the shadows revealed nothing. The following morning, under cover of weak sunlight filtering through ragged clouds, the household gathered once again in uneasy silence. Lydia Redstone, pale and defiant, kept to one side of the room, her eyes flicking from face to face, as though weighing their guilt against her own fears. Young Stephen, her nephew, sat with clenched fists, restless, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. Mrs. Withers, the housekeeper, bustled with unnecessary energy, dusting already polished furniture. And the vicar, Reverend Allerton, lingered nervously by the window, as though reluctant to leave, yet equally reluctant to stay. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap as she observed them. She saw not what they did, but how they did it. The trembling hand when Lydia lifted her teacup, the angry flush that rose on Stephen's neck whenever the Colonel's name was mentioned, the way Mrs. Withers avoided the staircase entirely, crossing the hall by the longer route. It was Stephen who finally broke the silence. Why must we remain here, like prisoners? The Colonel's death was tragic, yes, but surely the matter will be resolved without us hanging about this mausoleum of a house. His voice was raw with youth and resentment. It will be resolved, Miss Marple said softly, but not by impatience. You see, truth has a way of lingering, rather like a scent. It clings until one has the sense to follow it. Her words unsettled him. He pushed his chair back abruptly, muttered something under his breath, and left the room. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself once again at the base of the staircase, alone. She tapped her cane lightly against the lower steps. The sound confirmed her suspicion. A hollow chamber beneath. But how to open it? Her eyes fell upon a small, almost invisible seam in the woodwork at the side panel, masked by years of polish and dust. She pressed gently. It resisted. She pressed again, this time firmer. With a faint groan, a hidden drawer slid outward, stiff from age and neglect. Inside lay a bundle of papers, tied with a faded ribbon. Her heart quickened as she pulled them free. They were letters, dozens of them, addressed not to Colonel Redstone, but to Lydia. Some bore foreign stamps, others were unsigned, yet the handwriting was unmistakably the same bold script. Miss Marple's sharp eyes picked out the details, dates that coincided curiously with the Colonel's military postings, references to debts that must be repaid, and veiled threats should certain matters come to light. At that moment, a voice startled her. "What are you doing?" Lydia stood at the foot of the stairs, her face pale, but her eyes blazing. "I might ask you the same, Mrs. Redstone," Miss Marple replied calmly, tucking the letters into her knitting bag, for it seems these were not meant to see the light of day. "They are mine," Lydia whispered fiercely. "They were hidden there for a reason. You have no right at all." Miss Marple regarded her with quiet sympathy. When one hides letters beneath a staircase, one invites discovery. The truth, I fear, has a most inconvenient habit of surfacing. Before Lydia could reply, Inspector Graves entered. Seeing the open drawer, his eyes widened. "So it's true. The staircase was hiding something." He looked at Miss Marple with renewed respect. "What have you found?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she handed him the topmost letter. He read quickly, his brow furrowing, deeper with each line. This is blackmail." Lydia's composure crumbled. "You don't understand," she cried, her voice breaking. "I was protecting Stephen, protecting the family. If these had been revealed, the scandal would have destroyed us." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "And yet, perhaps it was not the scandal you feared most, but the person behind these letters. For you see, blackmailers rarely stop at one demand. They return again and again, until their victim has nothing left to give." The room seemed suddenly colder, the storm outside resuming its relentless battering. Lydia collapsed onto the nearest chair, her sobs muffled against her handkerchief. But Miss Marple was not finished. She turned to Inspector Graves. There is more here than wounded pride and family secrets. These letters, I believe, will lead us closer to the hand that struck the fatal blow. For blackmail is a chain, Inspector, and if we follow it carefully, we may yet discover whose hands are stained with murder. That night, when the house had quieted again, Miss Marple sat alone in her room. The letters spread before her, like pieces of a puzzle. One in particular caught her attention, a phrase written almost carelessly, yet betraying more than the writer intended. You may think your garden safe, but nothing stays buried forever. Her needles paused mid-click. She remembered the odd patch of disturbed earth she had noticed in the garden days ago, a patch Stephen had been so eager to dismiss. Chill ran down her spine. She gathered the letters, returned them to her bag, and extinguished the lamp. Tomorrow, she would suggest to Inspector Graves that they take a closer look at the garden. For beneath the staircase, she had found the blackmailer's hand, but in the garden, she feared, lay something far darker. And as she lay down to rest, the storm rattling the windows, she could not help but think that the truth was finally beginning to uncoil itself, ready to strike. The chapter closed. On the echo of her thought, if the staircase had yielded such a secret, what horrors might the garden conceal when daylight came to reveal them?